Thanks so much for coming. We got a great turnout. And I have to put, I'm getting old, I can't see. So we're very honored to have Bill Dedman here today. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning American journalist, as I think most of you probably know, and co-author of the #1 New York Times bestselling biography, Empty Mansions, The Mysterious Life of Huguette Clark and the Spending of a Great American Fortune. Dedman uncovered the case of reclusive copper heiress Huguette Clark in 2010 and documented her life in a series of reports for NBC News. Dedman and Clark's cousin, Paul Clark Newell Jr., co-wrote the nonfiction Empty Mansions about Clark and her father, William Andrews, the Gilded Age industrialist and senator. A TV series based on Empty Mansions is under development. He's a frequent speaker for nonprofit organizations, foundations, and financial companies, emphasizing the lessons learned from Huguette Clark's mistakes in estate planning.
She's a good object in what not to do.
If only to be in that position. He received the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting in 1989 for The Color of Money, a series of articles in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on racial discrimination by mortgage lenders in middle-income black neighborhoods. So we're very, very honored to have Bill Dedman with us here today. Let's give it a big round.
Let's see, so it's a tough decision. I've been wearing my mask studiously through our whole trip. I'm choosing at the moment not to wear one. I'm vaccinated. It's okay with you if I don't want to impose on you. I'm trying to do the right thing. But I think I'm going to do the talk without the mask. I'm going to be a little bit here and a little bit there showing you pictures. Part of my goal is to show you as many photos and to give you sort of an audio-visual tour of the story as much as the text. So if you just want to enjoy the pictures, that's okay with me. Make sure you're not blocked by the piano. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
You're good? If the young one in the front wants to pull a chair up here, she can.
She might be a little distracting, so.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We can all use that. It's fine. So while we're on the subject of the archives, which has invited me here, I just want to point out that there is Clark art that you may know about, you may not know about. 10 of his pieces came back to Montana after the Corcoran Museum, where he left his art, closed. And 6 of those pieces are over now at the Butte Public Archives, which is essentially 3 blocks up and 4 blocks over. And you can see them this week. You could go see them. It's officially over, but you could go see them next week. They're not going home until after next week. So if you're here, the hours at the archives are
Monday through Friday, 9 to 5.
Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So if you're in town tomorrow and you want to go over and see that art, you can. There's a brochure here for it, and we're going to pass that back and ask it to be on the table out front. So if you want to see that brochure before you go, it'll be on the table out there.
Where are they going after next week?
They go back to
Museum of Art and Culture in Missoula?
Yes, to the Missoula Museum at the University, where they came from the Corcoran. The Corcoran collapsed in Washington, and the art, most of it went to the National Gallery, and it's been distributed in a tight area around Washington, D.C., but because of the Montana connection, they sent some pieces to a new home. Okay. So thank you to everyone at the archives for helping put this event on. I want to mention the names. Ellen Crane is the director. Lindsay Mulcahy did all the work to put it together, so we have to say thank you to her. You've met Cara and Carrie Ann, and Christine is here as well. There you are. Carrie Ann and Christine work here at the Chateau, which is now run by the Butte-Silver Bow Public Archives. You may have heard a previous talk here by a historian in Montana, Keith Edgerton, who was very kind to Paul Newell and I when we were working on our book, and shared his files with us, and we shared what we had with him. And he's writing a book about W.A. Clark. And he spoke earlier in this series. Did anyone come to that event? Yes. So I'm gonna summarize in one quotation that talk, so that we can then start a bar fight over the points listed here. Okay. So Keith is a professor of history at MSU Billings. The cumulative sentiment here in Montana is that Clark made a fortune off of the state's resources in the freewheeling, laissez-faire times of the late 19th century, prostituted the political system with his wealth and power, exploited the working class for his own gain, left an environmental wreck behind, we're not done, and took his millions to other places to benefit a handful of others. And in some ways, the state has never really recovered from it all. There will always be the feeling here that we got robbed and left with the bill by W.A. Clark, Marcus Daly, and especially by Standard Oil and the Anaconda Copper Mine. It is visceral, and I think the story is now pretty much genetically encoded on our historic perception of ourselves, even if it gets increasingly mythologized on some levels. He's acknowledging some gap there between the popular story and fact. I'm not really here to offer a rebuttal to that, but I think we have a slightly different cast on it. So it's the legacy of the Clarks that is sort of the theme here. But I'm going to start you at the beginning, how I wandered into this story, and then how it unfolded for me. So it started when my wife and I were shopping for a home in Connecticut, and we got a little out of our price range. This home was the most expensive listed for sale in Connecticut at the time. It was a bargain. It was marked down from 30-some million to 20-some million. And my wife and I were moving from Boston to the New York, Connecticut area with our daughters, and we just needed a flat driveway they could ride their bikes on. And we were trapped in the real estate crash of 08, 09, and so we were landlords up in Boston unable to sell, and we were renters, therefore down in Connecticut, unable to buy. So there's a lot of frustration in that. So I just started taking the real estate listings and sorting them from most expensive to least to maximize my frustration. And so this house in New Canaan, it's about an hour north of New York City, is a French-style cottage with 15,000 square feet and 50 acres and a river. And I was looking up the homes on the town websites, the assessor's records, just to see who rich and famous people owned the homes. And I didn't know the name Huguette Clark, I didn't know how to say it, but I did see another note about this home on the town's website, and it said, oh, as you know, this home has been unoccupied since this owner bought it. But this owner had bought it in 1951, and we were in 2009 at that point. I'm not a particularly good noticer. My daughters are much better noticers, but I have learned through the experience of missing out on stories, I've learned that when I do notice something, I should act on it. So the next morning, I was over at the gate outside Beau Chateau, and a little old man in his sock feet came padding out in an undershirt out to the rusted gate and talked to me quite kindly, and he said that this was Mrs. Clark's home. And he made great pains to let me know that she was an excellent employer. He said he'd not met her, but he had only been there for 20 years. And he said his predecessors had been there longer, but they'd not met her. He said that the house was empty, unfurnished, and as far as he knew, it always had been. And he said the Jaguar in the garage was his. And, as I was leaving, he didn't let me in, but he was not unkind. And as I was leaving, he said, I'm sorry, I have to ask you a question. Do you think maybe she's been dead all this time? Well, I didn't know. But I was pretty sure that I wanted to find out. I thought I had found Huguette Clark next in Santa Barbara, where online I found her name attached to this house. A simple French style mansion of 20,000 square feet on 23 oceanfront acres, high, private, up on a mesa, so you could tell there's a house up there, but you can't see it from the public beach. And so I went to Santa Barbara, and I was thrown off of this property, and the man said, I'm very sorry, this is what you have to do to put food on the table for your family. But he tossed me out. But the legend in Santa Barbara was that the table set for dinner, the fireplace has wood, the fresh flowers, and that all turned out not to be true. But the legend was that no Clarks had been in this house, the family had not visited since 1951 or 52, and that turns out to be true. But the house was kept in what is still excellent condition, and we're going to take a little video photo tour of that home. So I thought I found Huguette in New York City at 72nd and 5th Avenue, overlooking Central Park, overlooking the pond where Stuart Little raced sailboats. And I'm told that happened. And she had half the top floor, the 12th floor, overlooking the park, and she had all of the 8th floor, 2 apartments, a total of 15,000 square feet. So if you've read the book, you know these facts. And the doorman there said, no, I've not seen her. I've worked here 20 years. I know she's not in the building. I've never seen her. Okay. So I called my editor, and I said, I don't think this is what you want me to do. I'd just written stories about firefighter deaths caused by faulty equipment. My latest project is on real estate discrimination and steering by realtors. That's the sort of thing I do. I don't know anything about celebrities, and this isn't my kind of thing. But my editor said, well, I think you should find her. I think you should find out what's going on. So I attempted to do that. My biggest confusion was whether or not Huguette Clark might still be alive. Just to take a moment on the longevity. W.A. Clark, one of the Copper Kings of Montana, was born in 1839 in a log cabin in Pennsylvania during the Martin Van Buren administration, our 8th president. He was 26 years old when the United States won the Civil War. How could his daughter, who was born in 1906 in Paris, while her father was serving in the United States Senate during the Teddy Roosevelt administration, how could she still be alive in 2009? But she was. And what had happened to the family legacy? In her youth, Huguette was on the magazine covers. Her father was on magazine covers. There were gossip columns about her. There were newspaper cartoons about her, and you'll see some of those in a minute. Now, where she was turned out to be the smallest part of the story. She was living in a hospital in New York City. She'd gotten ill. She checked into the hospital. She got cured. She got better. And she said, I think I feel safer here. I'd like to stay. And she could afford it. It was only $1,000 a night. So Huguette stayed in the hospital for 7,364 nights. She stayed in a hospital room for the last 20 years and 2 months of her life. Until she died, a couple years after I stumbled into this, she died at age 104. She was just short of her 105th birthday. Huguette was living in New York City when the Titanic went down. Her cousin, Walter, whom she knew well, died on the Titanic, and then there was a custody battle over his child. And she was still living in New York City on 9/11 and a decade beyond. The last photograph of Huguette published in the newspapers while she lived was taken on her honeymoon, and she headed off to Hawaii for a honeymoon in 1928. So she was the anti-Kardashian. Now, I want to talk a little bit about W.A. Clark. I'm going to show you a picture here. If it jumps forward, I'll go back. This is Clark's grandson, W.A. Clark III, and that's Paul Clark Newell. That's W.A. Clark. This is his great-nephew, Paul Clark Newell, whose son and I wrote the book together. And that's W.A. Clark's various relations, including Walter, who died on the Titanic. Now we'll let these, this is just a little bit of a family album. That's Anna, his second wife, at the Copper King Mansion, at the Clark home, right up the hill here. You recognize that front porch? And this is Huguette and her older sister Andre, and mother and father. And I'm going to let you sort out the rest of the pictures as they go. Now, it's really hard to sum up the career of W.A. Clark in just a sentence or two, but just a couple of the highlights. Oh no, they made us wear the same dresses. But just a couple of highlights. When the family moved from Pennsylvania to Iowa, he got some college. He took some law, some pre-law. And then he dropped out. He might have done a little school teaching. And the Civil War was about to begin. He did not fight in the war on either side, but he went west, probably ahead of the draft and because it was gold in the West. He went to Colorado, then up to Bannock and Virginia City, which soon were large enough communities to be the capital of the territory, of the state, before they went back down to 200 people when the gold played out. W.A. Clark had a lot of nervous energy. He was a tiny, very wiry fellow. He spoke confidently. He walked quickly. His hands were constantly in motion. He was a dynamo of alert intelligence. He weighed 120 to 125 pounds, his son said in a court case. His son said that he was 5'5", maybe 5'6", with his boots on. After W.A. Clark led the Constitutional Convention, which on his second go-around as leader of the Constitutional Convention, it achieved statehood for Montana. He was the chair of it. Then he listed himself in public records as 5'9". After he led the battle to place the state capitol in Helena, after he was chosen to be the head of the Masonic Lodge in the state, and his name is on the outside of the building in Helena,
Yes.
the lodge building around the left side, W.A. Clark's name is there, and they have some nice photographs of him in their museum. After he had entered politics as a candidate for the United States Senate, his passport applications listed him as 5'10". He was spectacularly good at spotting an opportunity. He was buried in a tomb larger than the log cabin he was born in. What's usually mentioned in terms of his business success is that he started not as a miner. He made a few bucks as a miner, but then he realized that there was more money to be made selling things to miners, pickaxes, eggs. So there was a great profit to be made if he went over the mountains, came back from Idaho with a load of groceries and hardware and sold those at a great markup. One of the newspaper cartoons that we get. He also then ran a wholesale business, ran a grocery store, then got into trading money for gold and then selling the gold to the Eastern banks. Then he became a banker himself. Bought into a bank, took over that bank, changed the name here in Butte. He was in business now with his younger brother, one of his brothers. The bank was not called Clark Brothers. It was called W.A. Clark and Brother. In Butte, he bought several mines. The story is told as though he acquired all of his mines by being a banker and foreclosing on loans. And that's a bit of a stretch. That may be how he got started, but he legally, somewhere on the line of ethics, he got his toehold and then developed further mines in Butte. He's best remembered in the civics classes in Butte High School as one of the participants in the War of the Copper Kings, which really is about not which of the mine owners will control the mines and the wealth, but which one would control the politics and who would be in the United States Senate. And W.A. Clark desired to be Senator Clark, failed to be the territorial representative, failed over and over and over to be the United States Senator, and then finally won, got right to the doorstep of the U.S. Capitol, and after hearings about bribery, he resigned from the United States Senate. The story is that Clark was paying money to the state legislators who chose U.S. senators in those days. One fellow came to start the legislative session with debts to a bank. Clark bought the bank, forgave the debt. Others just got cash. The scheme was described this way. I give you, Bill, an envelope, and you sign your name on the back of the envelope. We're going to seal it with $1,000 bills in it. And then you're going to sign your name on the back of the envelope. It's yours. This is your money. And then Clark's men are going to put that envelope back in their pocket until after the vote. So men showed up at a hearing in Helena with those envelopes. Now, as much as W.A. Clark spent to get elected to the United States Senate, his opponent, Marcus Daly, spent to keep Clark out of the Senate. And it really is impossible to know at this point to which extent this corruption happened, or did that corruption happen? Were these witnesses paid or telling the truth? But it was certainly enough to keep him out of the United States Senate. So there was a hearing held in Washington, and Clark was about to lose the vote. And this is one of my favorite scenes I think you'd have to put in the movie. Forgive me if you heard this story in the book, but we did it very quickly in one page, and I'll do it similarly quickly. W.A. Clark had to resign his seat in the U.S. Senate. He hasn't even served yet, and now he's about to get booted out, so he's going to resign. The governor of the state will appoint his successor. The governor of the state is with the Daly folks. So they trick the governor into getting out of the state. He's a property appraiser, and they get him some business, as freelance business in California, so he's gone on the railroad to San Francisco. While the governor is out of the state, they send a cable saying the coast is clear, and W.A. Clark submits his resignation. The cable goes to the lieutenant governor who's in the Clark camp. Now, he gets to appoint a successor to W.A. Clark. Whom do you think he appointed to replace W.A. Clark in the United States Senate?
W.A. Clark.
W.A. Clark. Well, of course, this was unwound quite quickly. The governor came back to the state and said, we're not having any of this. But then Clark was elected again, maybe honestly, maybe not, by the legislators who sent him again to the United States Senate. And he served a full term and retired, and was known the rest of his life as the senator. The, he focused his period in the U.S. Senate mostly on fighting Teddy Roosevelt's environmental reform. Conservation was bad for business. A national forest meant you couldn't cut timber on that land, or you'd have to pay more for other timber, and timber is what you need to hold up the walls in the mines. You need a lot of timber underground. In his resignation, in his farewell address, when he finished his full term in the U.S. Senate, W.A. Clark explained his view of the responsibilities that one generation owes to the next generation in the environment. He put it this way: in rearing the great structure of empire on the Western Hemisphere, he's talking about Butte, we are obliged to avail ourselves of all the resources at our command. It's not even a choice. We are obliged to do it. The requirements of this great utilitarian age demand it. Those who succeed us can well take care of themselves. Not a very popular view in today's world. I want to share with you a little bit of W.A. Clark in Montana. This is W.A. Clark and two other miners in Colorado when they just got started. He's the one on our right. One of these three men became the wealthiest man west of the Mississippi. On a Western tour, very late in his life here. Here's his first bank, Donald Clark and Larrabee. Here's W.A. Clark and brother. I told my brother that it was that's how we'd name a business if we went into it. Yeah, this is him as a young man, as head of the Masons in the state. One of his first lines in Butte. Marcus Daly on our right. Clark's briefcase as a senator. A trial exhibit. One of the newspaper cartoons showing W.A. Clark throwing money through the transom windows there. This is not Daley, this is a Pennsylvania senator, but this is Clark and the Pennsylvania senator saying what a fuss they made about us. Because they both were in questionable circumstances in the Senate. W.A. Clark has the money bag. Here he is as sort of a polecat returning to the U.S. Senate. Feeding money to democracy, firing money out of a cannon. This is how he was viewed in his life. With a niece, not Huguette, that's a niece, on a walk in the Easter parade in New York City. Buying a newspaper in Washington. Frequently in the newspapers. That's in Las Vegas. And by the way, that's Anna Clark on our right, his young wife, in 1905. The somewhat scandalous announcement that they had gotten married 4 years earlier and had a daughter that they hadn't bothered to tell anybody about. Clark's newspaper in Butte didn't believe the story when it was wired to them by W.A. Clark, thinking it was a political trick by the Daily. So the opposing newspaper got the scoop on the Clark marriage because they just didn't think it was true. Here's a depiction of Anna, his second wife, walking with his older daughter, Andre, in the middle, and another relative that's not Anna. His two daughters here at Columbia Gardens in Butte. The other highlight that should be mentioned is Clark's founding of Las Vegas. And the connection there is essentially that he had moved the family west to Los Angeles, had a lot of business interests in farming in Los Angeles area, and Los Angeles had not grown as San Francisco and other western towns had because it didn't have the port, it didn't have the rail line, and so it was a town of 10,000 people in 1905. And Clark connected the Port of Los Angeles to the east by building a rail line from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City to connect to the existing rail lines. And midway in that trip, they had a watering spot where there were already there was a mission there and a few inhabitants, and that spot was called Las Vegas. And he bought a lot of land there and then sold off the extra land in towns. The Clark's Las Vegas town site was the name of the community. And you could buy for a few dollars where the casinos sit today. Here's some homes and the photos in the Copper King Mansion just up the street.
And of course, it's Clark County.
And it's Clark County, of course, yes. So the county was named for him. But he really, in the last half of his life, he was known as the owner of mines in Butte, and then actually greater producing mines in Arizona, in Jerome, and in the company town he built there, Clarkdale, in northern Arizona. Clark was unlike many of the other mining millionaires in that he could write his name. He was well-read. He was interested in poetry and art and painting and music. And you see that reflected here in the home of his eldest son, Charlie. You see that at UCLA at the Clark Library in the West Adams neighborhood of Los Angeles, in the library built there by his younger son, W.A. Clark Jr. And you see that in the home that W.A. Clark then went on to build in New York. He had a first family here. His wife died of typhoid at the World's Fair in Chicago. And so he was a widower with 4 surviving, nearly grown children. And he considered Butte his home. He kept his home and his staff here. He had continuing business interests here into the early part of the 1900s. But by 1900, he had an additional home in New York City, and I just want to take you inside that home. It's the home on the cover of our book, because how could we resist it? So, the Clark home was the most expensive home built in New York City, with 131 rooms for a family of 4. So with his second wife, Anna, whom he met in Butte, who was 39 years younger than he, they had 2 daughters born in Paris, or both born in France, and when Huguette was 4 years old and her older sister was 7 years old, they came to New York City to live in this home with its art collection and its pipe organ and its golden room brought over from a house in Paris. And here's some of the items and interior photos of that house. W.A. Clark allowed the public to tour this house. He would issue tickets, and the public would be allowed to come in on Saturdays from 3 to 6 p.m. to tour the house and its 5 art galleries. He would personally give tours explaining each piece that he had acquired in Europe. He was a proud, careful collector, maybe not well informed, but enthusiastic. One of the pieces in the art that's being shown up at the archives is by Corot, who was very popular. The American millionaires love to buy Corot, and the story is told that therefore there was a market in fakes in Europe, and that it was said that out of 800 paintings created by Corot, the American millionaires had bought 1,000. I am confident that the ones that the Public Archives is showing you are genuine. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir played in the parlor of the Clark home in New York City. You have a pretty big parlor if they can sing in your choir. And he had essentially the finest collection of French art in this country. When he died, he tried to leave it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York with the condition that they keep it all together and display it permanently. And they didn't have a house like that, a building like that, unless they bought his house. So they said no to the gift. So that's why all the art ended up at his second choice, the Corcoran Gallery, across the street from the White House in Washington, D.C. The family paid for a Clark wing to hold the art. Now, I'd like to focus a little bit about the level to which the Clarks were or were not charitable and generous. Let's talk about their charity. The family bought that wing, built that wing at the Corcoran Gallery, which held his art, which was donated to the gallery. After the older sister, Huguette's older sister, died of meningitis just short of her 17th birthday on a camping trip. She was an active Girl Scout. It wasn't a Girl Scout trip. She was an active Girl Scout. And W.A. Clark was racing east on a train to get there, but his wife Anna sent him a telegram in Ralph saying that our daughter has died. She got meningitis and she was gone in 4 days. And that's Huguette on the left at a presentation the next year where they gave land in New York State and money for the first National Girl Scout camp, Camp Andre, named for the older sister. So there are thousands of girls who've gone to camp there. W.A. created in Los Angeles, where the family essentially had, his mother and his brothers were there and a couple of his sisters. He built a home in honor of his mother as a residence for women who were working and needed a safe place to live and to read and to study. So that was a charity in Los Angeles. If you're from this area, you're familiar with the Paul Clark home, which was for orphans at first, and then for women, for children in difficult circumstances generally, and is now a home for women. But it's just not a few many blocks west of here. Clark built contributed to the building of several churches and paid for the stained glass windows at this church, which is half a block east of us, right? Clark was a Presbyterian. His parents were Presbyterian, but after he became wealthy, he upgraded and became an Episcopalian.
So true.
Many of you may know of the Columbia Gardens, which was a garden spot, amusement park. Who's been to Columbia Gardens? There we go. Is it fair to characterize it as the nicest thing anybody ever put in Butte?
Yes.
Gardens, amusement park, flowers, picnic area ground, dance.
And a bus back and forth that the kids can take for a nickel.
A nickel ride from the city there. So for the children and minors and everyone else in town, it was a garden spot. And has been gone now for decades, but is fondly remembered. And that was paid for by W.A. Clark, who also owned the streetcars and the water and the electricity and a lot of other things. Here's another view of Columbia Gardens. But mostly, people, I think, remember Clark and Daley in Butte for the environmental damage left by the mines. Most spectacularly, the pit, the Berkeley pit, which is now, of course, filled up with water when they stopped pumping it out. this is an interesting one because the pit's not on Clark. The pit is on Daly and those who came after Daly. After he died, the Anaconda Company amalgamated, and the Anaconda Companies, they sold out to some Standard Oil folks who eventually sold out to Arco, and in that whole process they got down to where the ore wasn't as rich as before, and instead of working from the thousands of miles of shafts built down into the hill, they started strip mining. This was 30 years after W.A. Clark had died, but I suspect, you'll correct me, but I suspect that all gets blurred a little bit in the minds of the public, and Clark and Daly were the mine people, and there's the pit, so that's on him, and that may be the way people think about it. They may not assign blame so carefully as I might be doing. I'm getting a yes and a no. They don't put it on Clark, say.
Well, I don't know anybody who does, because of the 30 years he was dead.
Okay. And now, that's the fathers. I left out a few small charities, like he built a theater at the prison in Deer Lodge. Yes, there was a theater at the prison, and he paid $10,000 for it. But we're talking now about W.A. Clark Jr., the younger son, who was in Los Angeles, and was an enthusiast of the arts, and created the Los Angeles Philharmonic, now in its 101st year. Created it and then paid money to sustain it for years, and coincidentally played second violin. He also helped build the Hollywood Bowl. He wasn't the only funder, but he was one of the major funders of the Hollywood Bowl. His house is gone in West Adams, but the library on his property next to the house continues and was given to UCLA, even though it's not on the main campus. And yes, the shelves are made of copper. It has a collection of English literature, focus on Oscar Wilde. And while we're talking about W.A. Clark Jr., there's a new book called Twilight Man, which I encourage you to read. It's about W.A. Clark Jr. and his circle of friends, primarily focusing on his life as a married but gay man in the 1920s in Hollywood with his Hollywood friends in Los Angeles. And if you don't think they'll make a movie of that book, you're he left his three largest bequests to three of his male friends. He did also build several university buildings named for his first wife and for his second wife.
Did he have a career other than just being?
Yes, he worked for his father, and he and his brother, so W.A. Jr. or Will, and Charlie, the older brother, this is Charlie's house we're in now, were the chief executives of the United Verity Copper Company in Jerome. They ran that, and they did a lot of other parts of the family business. Huguette, when she was quite young, gave the money for a bird refuge in Santa Barbara near the family home. She and her mother gave the family ranch in Santa Barbara to the Boy Scouts. But her main bequest is that she's left money to a new foundation for the arts in Santa Barbara, housed at the home in Santa Barbara, which was a home built by her mother, which then she inherited, and which, as she explained to her cousin Paul, who wrote the book with me, she said, Paul said, why don't you go back to Bel Esguardo? And she said, well, it's my mother's house. My mother built it, and it would just make me sad to go back there without her. So after her mother became quite ill, they quit going west on the train in the early 50s. Her mother died in the early 60s. And the house was kept in very good condition all the way until Huguette died in 2011. Here's a couple of pictures of that home, but I'm going to go ahead and give you a tour of it with some video and other photos. And then we'll talk about what's going to happen to this home. So the Clarks started going, that's, the old man had died in 25. The house in New York was torn down in 27 because it was too expensive for anyone else to live in. It became an apartment building. Mother and daughter moved to apartments. Huguette graduated from high school. Isadora Duncan was her dance teacher in high school. She studied painting with a private painting instructor, and we'll see some of her paintings in a minute. And then they would vacation in Santa Barbara at the home that they built. And let me take you inside that home. So this is what it looks like from the public beach. But we're going to go up. So this is their vacation cottage. The circular area behind the house is the Mother's Rose Garden. This is the Andre Clark Bird Refuge.
Wow.
That's the zoo. That's downtown Santa Barbara and the public beach. And the view out to the Channel Islands. And I'll just give you a little visual tour of this house. So you get instructions to the staff at this house. We're not flowers on the table and that sort of hooey, but keep everything in first class condition and don't change anything. So if a tree fell in a storm, she wanted a similarly sized tree put in. Some of her desires were not quite attainable. You get spent to keep the home about $40,000 a month to $80,000 a month over the period from 1950 to 2011. She turned down many attempts to buy it. There were valid offers of $100 million. The Shah of Iran tried to buy it when he fled from Iran. There were many attempts to buy it, and she wouldn't sell. The cars stayed in the garage with license plates saying 1949 because no one was driving them. But I just want to get you a little sense of the detail in the home. And these are current photographs. One of the interesting features in the home is that 3 of the rooms, including, for example, this one, the paneling and ceilings of these rooms came out of the old Fifth Avenue mansion. Dealers bought the rooms when the house was torn down. When Anna was building a new home after the Santa Barbara earthquake, it was somewhat damaged. She wanted to put up a new home. That's this home in Santa Barbara. She bought her rooms back, and the architect made room for them. So the 3 of the rooms in this house were in a home built between 1900 and 1910 in New York City and had come from Europe and are hundreds of years old. So the foundation in Santa Barbara is making plans for tours. I think probably within 6 months, maybe a year, you'll be able to go online and buy a timed ticket and pay $40 and go tour the house.
So it ended up in a charitable foundation? Then?
Yes, and we tell in the book the story about a fight over the money. Relatives from the father's first marriage. Huguette had no children. She had no surviving sister. Her mother had no other living relatives. We tell about a fight where the father's descendants from his first marriage challenged the validity of her will. If they got the will thrown out, they would inherit. And so these were Huguette's half-great nieces and nephews who said she must be incompetent. Did we mention the doll collection? She has dolls. And she's not using her properties, and she must have been misled by her attorney, an accountant, and the nurse. And there was plenty of smoke which is partly what propelled my interest further. See if you can spot any red flags. A nurse had received $30 million in gifts from Huguette. Her accountant is a registered sex offender in the state of New York. Her attorney's charity, not the attorney, but a charity he favored, had gotten a $2 million gift. The Connecticut home was for sale. A Renoir had been sold. Why were they raising money? She died owing about $60 million in estate taxes, and more than that in gift taxes. And so the estate was clearly a mess. And so the family went to court, and in a settlement, the family got about $40 million, about 1/10 of her fortune that was remaining. And other beneficiaries that she listed in the will got money. A goddaughter, the people who took care of her apartments, her favorite doctor, her hospital, the Cork room. And then the remainder, which is essentially this house and a few $1 million, went to a charitable foundation for the arts in Santa Barbara. Huguette's dog collection was sold last year, as I'll show you in a minute. But these pictures were taken for the doll auction, and that's why there are dolls in all the rooms. They're not going to make a doll museum, but they had them out.
Bill, before you leave that, I gather that no money came to anybody or any institution in Butte-Town.
We tell in the book about no money from Huguette. I think there was some money early on to the Clark home. Then later, there was an attempt to get her to buy a new roof for the Clark home. She said no. She didn't respond. I think there was, in general, a reluctance to send money to people who asked for money. And Huguette clearly showed a preference to give money to people she knew. Her best friend, who brought her, her doctor's widow, who brought her brioche and lunch food, her men who took care of her apartments, her attorney and accountant, her goddaughter. She was much closer to them, and all her old telephone and pen pal friends in France from her early days, people she'd known for 95 years. And she sent them $30,000 here and $50,000 there, but didn't respond very well to charitable inquiries from anyone other than the Corcoran Gallery, where she had such a firm connection. So there's a little bit of a tour of the home in Santa Barbara.
But had the Corcoran Gallery collapsed before she died?
The Corcoran Gallery collapsed just after she died,
Okay.
partly because she didn't give it all her money. They were counting on the money. And they got a painting, a Monet water lilies that had been in her dining room. And they sold it for about $10 million, and they got that, but they didn't get a huge bequest. Now, I'd like to take you to a couple of places that just on my journey, I was introduced to her cousin, Paul. And Paul was a better investigative reporter than I was, because he had thought to look for Huguette Clark in the Santa Barbara telephone directory. And the men there pass on messages to her attorneys in New York, and he started corresponding with her. Paul is Huguette's cousin, second cousin. Paul's father was Huguette's first cousin. And Paul's father had been writing a book about the senator, the great man in the family. And he died. So Paul took up the challenge of trying to write such a book. And so he was interviewing all the older relatives, and he wanted to talk to Huguette. And before he knew it, Huguette was calling him. In fact, here's the first call Huguette made to him on his answering machine. I think I have that. Here we go. Notice how prepared she is for this conversation. She's nearly 90. Notice how open she is about an illness. You're going to see her words on the screen, and I think this is going to play. If not, we'll adjust the speakers.
Okay, this is your answer, Garrett. And I did call the younger number, but I didn't get an answer. So I'm talks about the things to get older, my age to match it. So anyway, but I'm getting along fine. The people went down and everything's okay. And that's like a thank you for the pictures. Your room is beautiful and your little grandson is adorable. Your little grandson Eric.
Now, I was prepared to believe that Huguette is being controlled by her money men and she's kept away. We haven't talked much about Huguette's reclusivity. We think Huguette last went out of the house in the 1950s or the 1960s. We have some evidence that she was out in the 60s to take photographs around New York City, maybe later. We know she went out in the 50s and 60s to have her best Stradivarius violin restrung. We know that she went to a fashion show at the French consulate, not because she wanted Christian Dior clothes for herself, but for her doll collection. And we'll see those in a minute. At one point, Huguette stopped going out. And she was famously reclusive. Paul knew she was reclusive. He talked to her off and on for about 10 years. He had no idea she was living in a hospital. He would send mail to Fifth Avenue, and he'd get mail back from Fifth Avenue. He didn't know somebody was ferrying it back and forth from the hospital. He would talk to her on the phone when she would call him. They started arranging phone calls at certain times so she wouldn't get his voicemail. And Paul tape recorded a few of these conversations, not because he thought Huguette would ever be well known. I hadn't stumbled in to do my stories yet. He just was interested in her father and was looking for any scraps that he could get. And my perception of Huguette's competence was greatly influenced by Paul describing their discussions, and by the half an hour or so of audio tapes. In the audio version of our book, there's half an hour at the end that you can hear them chatting. But I just want to play you a couple of selections of that. This is Huguette describing, these are all very brief, the building of the home in Santa Barbara by her mother and why her mother built the new home. To give work, maybe she doesn't mention that, but she was very proud of the fact that her mother built the home so the workers during the Depression would have work.
All these national catastrophes, international catastrophes.
Santa Barbara was the 1925 earthquake, 1925. And the movie theater that we used to go to that came all down, imagine.
Yeah.
People would have been killed if they did, because they're at 6 in the morning.
Yes.
So many people were saved. That's one other building of the house because it wasn't very solid, Anyway, but there was something, that shaking.
Oh, it's terrifying.
Yes, terrible, yes.
Yes.
But it was nothing in comparison to Turkey.
Although she lived in a hospital room for 20 years, Huguette had NPR, she had the New York Times, and she had correspondence and phone calls, and all of her calls with Paul, as all the calls with your East Coast relatives, began with, are those wildfires in your yard, right? I see on the news that your state is burning, right?
Kahanamokus, the ones they used to take us out on the surfboard. Kahanamokus, he was the captain swimmer at the time. And he would come and stay with him, in the water.
Yes.
It was nice, yes.
You have a wonderful memory for these details.
Because you see, they used to have sharks around there, and if you go with them, you'd be more safer.
I see.
We have pictures of Huguette on the beach with Duke Kahanamoku and his brothers. The king of surfing. And while we're on the topic,